We're back after some tech problems. So, Paul, you do a lot of teaching and mentoring. Why don't you tell us a bit about what you do?
Well, in addition to being a trial lawyer, I also have had the great fortune of teaching undergraduates for the last 7 years in areas of criminal justice. And so I've enjoyed crafting the courses for the students. I teach a course on surveillance, which really delves into the whole nature of privacy in this post-technological, post-industrial age, and surveillance, and how privacy interests and privacy protection run up against this mass surveillance state. And so I teach a course on surveillance, which I really enjoy, and I've crafted that over the years. I also teach a course on civil rights and civil liberties, where I talk about the importance of the Bill of Rights and the rights that are guaranteed, not only the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment, but also the full panoply of rights under the Sixth Amendment. And we also delve into the Eighth Amendment as well. Then
when you teach that, what are your students most surprised about?
I think that generally, I would say this about undergraduates overall, I think they're genuinely surprised about their own lack of knowledge regarding the historical roots of the country they find themselves in now. I think the loss of history is probably the most striking thing to me that resonates with them, their sense of naivete or just lack of knowledge. And one of my mantras is reclaim history. You go back and reclaim history so that you understand that, the rise of the middle class was a power struggle between, the robber barons and the unions in this country. And it was a class struggle. And it was, the very nature of the civil rights movement goes to the roots of our segregationist state and the racist nature of this country. And urging them to go back and look at the development of the social and political movements that define the modern post-industrial state, and the response by the government and by corporate America against the expansion of those rights, and the give and take and the tug of war over the course of history between those elements, I think is critical for them in understanding the nature of this country and where they find themselves now in the post-industrial state. So Rob, have I lost you?
No, I'm here.
So can you see me?
Yes.
All right, I've lost, let me see, I've lost you. Hold on a second, let me see. I'll just keep talking. So essentially what I've noticed is that part of it, and that's been the most compelling part of my teaching, is to give them an opportunity to look at history and to reclaim history with a modern view.
Are there particular books that you assign them to read?
Oh yeah, and it depends upon the course. For example, the course I just finished, which is focused on mass incarceration and the death penalty, I asked them obviously to look at Michelle Alexander's book, and they read a good portion, if not almost the entire book that she wrote, which delves into the real historic nature of mass incarceration. And her book is Mass Incarceration and the New Jim Crow. And a lot of what she writes about has been there available to scholars and to the public. She just was able to put it in a very powerful kind of platform for a discussion to begin in a much more profound way around 8 or 9 years ago. I also assigned Austin Surratt's book about the death penalty and many of the articles that have been written over the years about the death penalty. He teaches it, I believe, at Amherst, or did. And then it's a full panoply of articles from a variety of different progressive writers over the course of time. And what I found is it's really important, for example, in my surveillance course, to go back and read some of the critiques, not only Foucault's panopticism and the panopticon, which is a takeoff of Jeremy Bentham's panopticon. And so I have them read Foucault. I have them read articles following and critiquing Foucault. But I also have them read pre-9/11 critiques of the modern surveillance state, and then, of course, post-9/11 and the transformation of our democracy, in large part based on the expansion of the powerful surveillance state that we have now currently. So I give them a variety of reading sources, and my intention is to give them an historical perspective, but also to inform their current their current kind of consciousness about where they find themselves as citizens and as residents of this country in post-industrial society.
What's the message you want to have your students take away from your course on surveillance?
That democracy is possible still, that we could create democracy even in light of the very powerful surveillance, both consumer, corporate, and government surveillance that pervades our lives. And I think the quest for privacy. So one of the kind of the instrumental things I do in the beginning is I have them focus on 10 or 15 areas of privacy that they believe are core areas of privacy that need to be protected, that are parts of their sovereignty as individuals. And then I show them in each one of those realms how it's been co-opted or undermined by surveillance, whether it's consumer and corporate surveillance, whether it's workplace surveillance, or whether it's government surveillance. And what I really want them to develop is a sense of empowerment. And so towards the end of the course, I ask them to redefine not only privacy in this post-industrial technocratic age, but also to redefine resistance in this age of surveillance, in this age of mass surveillance. You know, every one of them is connected to a smartphone. Every one of them is connected to the internet. Every one of them is connected to social media. And I talk about what it was like to be an individual, as I grew up decades ago, where there was no mass surveillance on the highways. There was no GPS on your cars. There was no tracking device. We weren't linked to a leash, an electronic leash, and what that meant in terms of our consciousness and freedom. And it wasn't defined by the real inherent notion that Big Brother is always watching, whether it's on the computer, whether it's on the iPhone. And I think that in large part there's too readily an acceptance by this younger generation of surveillance as an integral part of their daily lives. And what I want them to do is re-examine that a little bit and create a sense of resistance in the age of mass surveillance. And I think by the end of it, it's a positive message. And I think with the creative minds that I've had in my classes, they've been able to do that.
How is it a positive message? What do you teach them that they're positive about?
To resist the mass surveillance that exists, to think of creative ways to communicate outside the box, to become free from their iPhones, from their Androids, from their social media, to reclaim a sense of community that's not mediated by the electronic media, that they can create a sense of camaraderie and communion with people face to face, to reintegrate the notion of a face to face society as opposed to one that's one step away and alienated by the electronic media that all of us are unfortunately connected to in some way. So,
I'm getting ready to, I'm interviewing Chris Hedges next week. And his book, America, the Farewell Tour, is a pretty dark book about just how bad things are.
I have not read it, but I'm always of the view that the critique comes before the creation of something new. So you need the critique, you need the challenge, you need the ability. Part of resistance is able to understand the society with which you're in and the situation with which you're in. And once you understand the cage around you, whether it's an electronic cage or a real cage, then you can start to think about freedom and how to break out of that cage. So I think it begins with the resistance. It begins with the critique. Now, some people never get beyond it. My hope is that I provide a pathway to a positive view towards relinquishing this totalitarian world, relinquishing ourselves from this totalitarian world. And I think teaching young minds to be critical thinkers is the first step.
I think that's really important. And the reason I brought up Chris's book is because one of the things he says is we've got exactly what you're saying. We need to return to community. We need to get local. And he also advocates for civil disobedience. And you're a real important part of that, of course, helping to defend people when they do that.
Absolutely. And let me tie in two things to what I want to say about this young generation. First of all, this young generation has also demonstrated tremendous positive and creative energy in creating those face-to-face societies and communities. So despite the fact that I'm a critic of social media and the electronic cage that's created, I'm also very heartened and excited by the efforts that the young generation have made in creating local economies and local face-to-face communities and non-hierarchical organizations. So I don't want to make it completely a negative critique. I want to emphasize that I strongly believe that this next generation, this new generation, has demonstrated all of that very powerfully. With respect to representing individuals charged with various offenses, when either the defense has been, justification, or, in many of the cases we won on First Amendment grounds as well. One of the key principles in defending those cases is educating the judges and or the juries about how the First Amendment, the protections under the First Amendment, what we know to be our freedom, intersects with the power of the state. And oftentimes that's educating, as I said, judges on how the First Amendment issue intersects with, the statutes that are invoked and are utilized in arresting people, whether it's obstruction of the highway or disorderly conduct or failure to disperse or obstruction of justice. In each one of those cases where there is a mass arrest based on protests, where we've been successful, and not just me, but a group of strident lawyers who have been committed to civil liberties and fighting these cases in the courts, where we've been successful, or when we've been successful, it's when we've been able to educate the trier of fact, whether judge or jury, on the importance and protections under the First Amendment.
You got me thinking. There's an effort now to make it illegal to support boycott of Israel.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate. I think that, well, go ahead, finish your question, and I'll try to answer.
The question is, where will that stand when it gets to court?
Well, it depends upon the context, obviously. I mean, here's a very vital part of our democracy on any important issue.
Well, let me just, what the laws are saying is that people will not be allowed to be contracted with or hired by different organizations unless they sign a pledge that they will not engage in a boycott of Israel.
Well, those political limitations are not new. These were, this goes back to the Union era when there were attempts to undermine boycotts by pledges of various companies and or organizations that were either being targeted by unions or were supportive of unions. So the tactic is not new, and it's a limitation on the right to association. It's a limitation on First Amendment rights in any context. And so I'm a strong believer in the First Amendment because I believe the First Amendment is the ultimate paramount right in protecting, that in the Fourth Amendment as well, but the ultimate paramount right in protecting our democracy. So regardless of whether the issue is a political issue, a social issue, a foreign policy issue, the First Amendment must be protected at all costs. And that means, First Amendment requires disruptive and difficult speech, difficult dialogue over all kinds of issues may be contentious. But the dialogue is what needs to be protected. Not any one particular political position necessarily, but the dialogue needs to be protected. So that's my belief, because I think once you have contracts or you have limitations on First Amendment rights, you're on your way towards undermining the very roots of our democracy.
So have you ever represented somebody who, for their First Amendment rights, where you couldn't stand what they said?
I have not chosen to do so, but I have certainly seen in the context of, certain cases that are brought by the ACLU, for example, the certain context in those cases where the First Amendment was protected. But I personally have a political point of view, and I have an ideological point of view, and I have a very progressive point of view. So while I speak very strongly about the First Amendment and laud the protections, I personally decide to represent those people that I have some philosophical adherence with. And that's my choice. And that's been my political position from the time that I became a lawyer. Now, in the context of representing those charged with criminal offenses generally, obviously I'm not someone who has backed away from difficult criminal cases. I've taken those difficult criminal cases based on the principle that everyone has a right to a defense and everyone has a right to a vigorous defense. And any undermining of those particular procedural rights in court undermines all of our rights. So I take that position, across the board. But in the context of the pro bono representation that I've engaged in, I've decided to represent those individuals and those groups that I have a political and ideological alliance with.
Okay, so we've got 2 minutes left. we talked off the phone, off the radio about I suggested you've got a great book there. If you had a message that you wanted to put into a book, what would that message be?
Wow, that's a great question. And thinking about it as you asked it, and we did talk about it, and I certainly feel motivated to write. Certainly, I've been motivated for a long time. I guess the message is this: that regardless of what form, political authority and power and hierarchy emerges, whether it's in kind of a monolithic corporate state, whether it is the bureaucracy of an institution like a university, or even in the criminal justice system, the autocratic and dictatorial control that a judge has in a courtroom, regardless of whatever form it takes, in order to be real adherents to democracy, we have to challenge it. And that challenge takes many different forms, and the resistance takes many different forms. Because in order to achieve this ongoing creation of an ideal for democracy, we have to practice it every day. And as I mentioned earlier in our earlier segment, democracy takes many forms, and we have to identify what it looks like, and in particular, participatory democracy. And so my message is resistance and democracy are united. That if, in fact, if the clarion call for freedom is resistance, then the goal for that clarion call and that quest for freedom has to be some democratic form of life in all of our institutions. And I guess
so. What you're basically saying then is democracy requires to be to have a vivacious democracy, a living democracy. It must be constantly challenged.
Constantly, it requires resistance. It is in the nature of the struggle for democracy is resistance.
This is the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. You've been listening to an interview with Paul Hetznecker, defense attorney extraordinaire. Thanks so much, Paul.
Rob, it's been an honor to be on. I thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.